What you are about to witness is not a political debate. It is not a difference of opinion. It is not a culture war. What you are about to witness is a documented, evidence-based, historically verified account of the most aggressive dismantling of American civil rights in modern history, executed not by accident, not by ignorance, but by design. The 47th President of the United States has built what historians, legal scholars, and civil rights organizations are now calling a permission structure for hate, a machine, an apparatus, a government-sanctioned architecture of regression, brick by brick, executive order by executive order, tweet by tweet, dragging this nation backward toward the racial realities of a century ago. This is the story of how it happened. This is the story of where it came from. And this is the story of what it means for every single American, regardless of race, regardless of party, if we allow it to continue. You are watching the architecture of regression. Let us begin with the facts. From January 2025 to February 2026, the Trump administration has executed what legal scholars at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and Amnesty International USA have all independently described as the most aggressive, most synchronized assault on black civil rights since the dismantling of Reconstruction. We are not talking about policy disagreements. We are not talking about budget priorities. We are talking about a coordinated multi-front campaign through executive orders, legislative action, judicial manipulation, and raw presidential rhetoric to strip Black Americans, Brown Americans, poor Americans, and vulnerable Americans of the legal protections that generations of activists bled and died to secure. The administration calls it merit. They call it common sense. They call it restoring opportunity. We call it what it is: a white nationalist wish list, operationalized, funded, and defended from the highest office in the land. The hate in this administration's heart is not a malfunction. It is not a side effect. It is the operating system. And to understand why, you have to understand where it came from. You have to go back, all the way back, to 1927. To understand the ferocity of the current assault on Black America, you must understand one fundamental truth. For this president, racism is not a political position. It is not a strategy. It is not even a choice. It is a family tradition. The policies of 2026 are not new ideas. They are high-definition remasters of 1927, and the man who wrote the original score was not Donald Trump. It was his father. The rot begins with the father. On Memorial Day, 1927, in Jamaica, Queens, New York, the annual Queens County Memorial Day Parade was violently disrupted. 1,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan, robed, organized, and armed with ideology, forced their way into the procession, marching to assert what they called native-born Protestant supremacy over the streets of New York City. Police intervened. Arrests were made. Among those arrested was a man named Fred Trump. Fred Trump, the real estate developer, the patriarch, the man who would go on to build the fortune that bankrolled his son's entire empire, the man who sat at the dinner table with the future 47th President of the United States. He was arrested at a Ku Klux Klan rally. Now, the Trump family has spent decades trying to bury this fact. The president himself, when confronted with it during the 2016 campaign, denied it flatly. But the evidence is not in dispute. It is documented in contemporaneous newspaper records from the New York Times and the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. It was confirmed by academic historian Owen Ayers in a peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of Urban History in 2021, titled Fred Trump, the Ku Klux Klan, and Grassroots Redlining in Interwar America. Fred Trump was there, and the ideology he stood beside that day did not die in Queens in 1927. It was passed down, refined, institutionalized, and it now sits in the Oval Office. The Klan rally of 1927 was not an isolated incident. It was a preview. 46 years later, in 1973, the United States Department of Justice filed a federal lawsuit against Trump Management Incorporated, the company run by Fred Trump and his son, Donald Trump. The charge: systematic, deliberate, documented racial discrimination in housing. Federal investigators had uncovered a scheme that was breathtaking in its brazenness. Employees of Trump management were instructing rental agents to secretly code applications submitted by black citizens. The code was simple, elegant, in a grotesque sort of way. They marked them with the letter C, C for colored. Applications marked C were rejected, white. Applicants were welcomed. Black families were turned away from buildings their tax dollars helped finance, their labor helped build, and their community helped sustain. 4 superintendents and rental agents provided sworn testimony confirming the practice. The Department of Justice stated plainly that an underlying pattern of discrimination continues to exist in the Trump Management Organization. The case is documented. It is not disputed. It is a matter of federal court record. The President of the United States did not learn his housing philosophy from policy briefings. He did not develop his views on black tenants from academic study. He learned it at his father's knee. He learned it in the buildings his father built. He learned it from the C stamped on the applications of black families who just wanted a place to live. And as we will show you tonight, that lesson has never left him. We are not the first to sound the alarm about the Trump family's relationship with racial hatred. In the 1950s, the legendary American folk singer Woody Guthrie, the man who wrote "This Land Is Your Land," rented an apartment from Fred Trump in the Beach Haven complex in Brooklyn, New York. What he witnessed there moved him to pick up a pen. Guthrie wrote song lyrics, never published in his lifetime, but preserved in his archives and later discovered by researchers, that explicitly condemned Fred Trump for using racial hatred as a deliberate business tool. He wrote, and I quote, "I suppose /old man Trump knows just how much racial hate he stirred up." Woody Guthrie, the conscience of American folk music, writing about Fred Trump in the 1950s, the man who would become the 47th President of the United States grew up in that world. He grew up in those buildings. He grew up at that table. He grew up breathing that air. And now, 7 decades later, the racial hate that Woody Guthrie documented in a Brooklyn apartment complex has been scaled up, institutionalized, and given the full power of the federal government to enforce it. The inheritance is complete. The administration has moved beyond dog whistles. They have moved beyond coded language, plausible deniability, and the polite racism of policy papers. The 47th President of the United States is now using the most powerful communications platform on earth, the official social media account of the American presidency, to deploy the most violent, most historically loaded dehumanization tactics in the racist playbook. And he is doing it in broad daylight, with a smile. On February 6, 2026, the President of the United States reached a nadir of racial abuse that shocked the world. He posted a video on Truth Social, the official social media account of the American presidency, depicting Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, the nation's first black first family, as monkeys, dancing to "The Lion Sleeps Tonight." This is not a rumor. This is not a political attack ad. This is documented fact, confirmed by PBS NewsHour, Reuters, Politico, the BBC, Al Jazeera, Le Monde, and Amnesty International USA, among dozens of other credible news organizations. A Republican senator, a member of the president's own party, called it, and I quote, "the most racist thing I've seen out of this White House." Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee introduced a formal resolution to censure the President of the United States for the post. Amnesty International USA issued a statement saying, "This is part of a trend by the President of dehumanizing rhetoric, followed by blame and deflection. When racist imagery is amplified or normalized by those in power, it puts people at risk." Barack Obama himself, with characteristic dignity, responded indirectly, noting that a majority of Americans find this repugnant, and calling the entire episode a clown show. Now, let us be absolutely clear about what this was. This was not a joke. This was not a meme. This was not an accident. The depiction of black people as monkeys, apes, and primates is the oldest, most violent, most historically documented dehumanization tactic in the arsenal of American white supremacy. It was used by slavers to justify the enslavement of African people. It was used by segregationists to justify Jim Crow. It was used by lynch mobs to justify murder. And on February 6, 2026, it was used by the President of the United States to depict the first black president and first lady of this nation. The video was eventually deleted, but the signal had been sent, loud, clear, and unmistakable. When the world reacted with horror, the White House did not apologize. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stood at the podium of the most powerful press briefing room on earth and dismissed the global outrage as, and I quote, fake outrage and a joke. Let that sink in. The official spokesperson for the President of the United States called the dehumanization of the first black first family of America a joke. By doing so, the White House made something official that had previously only been implied. Anti-black mockery is a protected executive privilege. The president can reduce black leaders to animals, and the official position of the United States government is that you are wrong to be offended. This is not a communications failure. This is not a PR mistake. This is the permission structure operating exactly as designed. The president dehumanizes. The press secretary normalizes. The media cycles. And somewhere in Ohio, somewhere in Florida, somewhere in every corner of this country where hate has been waiting for permission, the message is received. History teaches us this lesson with brutal clarity. Every authoritarian regime that has used dehumanization as a political tool has also had spokespeople who called it humor, who called the outrage manufactured, who told the victims they were being too sensitive. We have seen this before. We know how it ends. The consequences of presidential dehumanization are not abstract. They are not theoretical. They are visceral, documented, and terrifying. On February 7, 2025, just weeks after the new administration took power, a neo-Nazi paramilitary group marched through Lincoln Heights, Ohio. Lincoln Heights is a majority black community in the Cincinnati metropolitan area, a community of families, of children, of people who simply wanted to live their lives. The neo-Nazis showed up on a highway overpass above Interstate 75, waving swastika flags, shouting racial slurs, and brandishing weapons. This was not a protest. This was not a demonstration of free speech. This was a hunting party, authorized by the atmosphere of impunity radiating from Washington, D.C. NBC News, CNN, The Washington Post, The Guardian, and local Cincinnati media all confirmed the event. Body camera footage from an Evendale police officer captured the moment he approached the demonstrators, and they told him to his face that they had every right to be there. The community of Lincoln Heights responded with extraordinary courage. They formed the Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch Program, an armed civilian patrol to protect their own neighborhood because the federal government had made clear it would not protect them. A Republican Ohio state representative condemned the demonstration, but condemnation without consequence is just noise. The Guardian, reporting on the aftermath in July 2025, captured a resident's words that should haunt every American. Our sense of safety was violated. This is what the permission structure produces. This is what happens when the President of the United States posts videos of black leaders as monkeys. This is what happens when the White House calls it a joke. The neo-Nazis in Ohio got the message. They always do. While the president tweets hate and neo-Nazis march through black neighborhoods, the real machinery of regression is being assembled quietly, methodically, and lethally inside the federal bureaucracy. The administration's appointees are conducting a scorched earth campaign against the very concept of equity. They are not just rolling back regulations, they are dismantling the legal architecture that has protected Black Americans for 60 years. They are doing it with executive orders, with budget cuts, with the strategic deployment of the Department of Justice as a weapon against the very communities it was created to protect. On January 21, 2025, his first full day back in power, the president signed Executive Order 14,173, titled, "With breathtaking Orwellian audacity, ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity." Let us translate that title into plain English. What this order actually does is revoke Executive Order 11,246, a landmark civil rights achievement signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965. EO 11246 was the legal foundation that required federal contractors, companies that do business with the United States government, employing millions of American workers, to maintain affirmative action programs and ensure equitable hiring practices. For 60 years, EO 11246 was the law. For 60 years, it was the mechanism by which the federal government said to corporate America, "You will not discriminate. You will open your doors. You will give everyone a fair shot." With one signature on day one, that 60-year commitment was erased. The Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, the agency responsible for enforcing these requirements, was immediately stripped of its power. Federal contractors were effectively told, "You no longer need to hire equitably." But the order did not stop at erasure. It went further. The DOJ was unleashed to actively hunt down private companies that maintained voluntary DEI programs, threatening them with what the order calls civil compliance investigations. This is not deregulation. This is a state-sponsored protection racket, a legal weapon designed to bully corporations into whitening their boardrooms, their executive suites, and their workforces. The administration calls it merit. But merit has never been the issue. The issue has always been access, and they just slammed the door. The very same day, January 20th, 2025, Inauguration Day, the president signed a second executive order, EO 14,151, titled Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing. The word radical is doing a lot of work in that title. So is wasteful, because what this order actually terminated were the offices, programs, and positions created to ensure that the federal government, the largest employer in the United States, reflected the diversity of the nation it serves. DEI offices closed immediately. DEI employees placed on administrative leave, then fired. DEI training programs canceled. DEI-related websites and publications taken down. The message sent to every Black federal employee, every Latino federal employee, every woman who had fought her way into a position of influence in the federal government was unmistakable. Your advancement was radical. Your inclusion was wasteful. You are not welcome here. The administration will tell you this was about fiscal responsibility, about meritocracy, about ending preferencing. But let us be honest about what preferencing actually means in this context. For 400 years, this country preferenced white men. For 400 years, the merit system was a closed door with a whites-only sign. DEI programs were not preferencing. They were correction. They were the government's attempt to level a playing field that had been deliberately tilted for centuries. And on day one, the administration kicked the table over. The administration knew that federal judges might look at these executive orders and find them unconstitutional. They knew that civil rights organizations would rush to court. They knew that the judiciary, the last line of defense, might stop them. so they moved to neuter the judiciary before it could act. In April 2025, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 1526, the No Rogue Rulings Act of 2025, or NORA. The bill severely restricts the ability of federal courts to issue nationwide injunctions against presidential orders. Under NORA, if a court finds that a presidential order violates the Constitution, that ruling only applies to the specific plaintiffs in that specific case. Every other victim of the same illegal order has to file their own lawsuit, fight their own battle, spend their own money. The administration's own statement in support of the bill declared that activist courts were weaponizing injunctions to undermine President Trump's agenda. Let us translate that too. Activist courts means courts that follow the Constitution. Weaponizing injunctions means enforcing the law. Undermining the agenda means protecting civil rights. Unidos, the nation's largest Latino civil rights organization, said it plainly. When courts determine that a federal policy violates the Constitution or statutory law, nationwide injunctions ensure this determination applies uniformly across the country. NORA is not judicial reform. It is a preemptive shield, a legal fortress designed to make the administration's illegal orders lawsuit-proof, or at least lawsuit-exhausting. The strategy is simple. Make the cost of fighting back so high, so slow, and so financially devastating that most victims simply give up. The administration understands something that every authoritarian movement in history has understood. If you want to maintain a system of oppression, you must first control what children are taught about the past. You must erase the history of resistance. You must criminalize the language of equity. You must ensure that the next generation grows up believing that the civil rights movement was a mistake, that the struggle for equality was radical, and that the current order of things is natural, inevitable, and just. The Department of Education has been transformed into the Ministry of Erasure, and the targets are the most vulnerable people in the system: children. On April 23, 2025, the President signed Executive Order 14,280, titled Reinstating Common Sense School Discipline Policies. Once again, let us translate. The Obama administration had issued guidance to schools across the country requiring them to examine racial disparities in their discipline practices. The data was, and remains, overwhelming. Black students are suspended, expelled, and referred to law enforcement at dramatically higher rates than their white peers for the same or lesser infractions. This is not a theory. It is documented in federal data, academic research, and the lived experience of millions of black families. The Obama guidance said, look at this disparity, examine it, address it. EO 14,280 says, ignore it. By eliminating the disparate impact standard from school discipline enforcement, the administration has given schools federal legal cover to continue suspending and expelling black children at disproportionate rates, without consequence, without scrutiny, and without accountability. UC Law San Francisco, in a research brief published in July 2025, concluded that EO 14,280 mischaracterizes the impacts of the previous guidance and will cause direct harm to minority students. The Education Trust called it one of 2 executive orders that hinder school discipline progress and civil rights. What this executive order does, in plain terms, is reopen the school-to-prison pipeline. It oils the machinery that funnels black children out of classrooms and into the juvenile justice system. It criminalizes adolescence for minority youth and calls it common sense. There is nothing common sense about it. There is nothing sensible about it. It is a deliberate, documented, policy-driven assault on the futures of black children. The executive orders are devastating enough. But the administration's assault on civil rights in education goes deeper, into the bureaucratic machinery that was supposed to enforce the law. The Office for Civil Rights, the federal agency within the Department of Education, responsible for investigating discrimination complaints from students and families, has been systematically dismantled. When the Trump administration took office in January 2025, the OCR already had approximately 20,000 pending discrimination complaints. Rather than addressing the backlog, the administration fired OCR attorneys, froze investigations, and effectively shut down the agency's enforcement capacity. By December 2025, the backlog had grown to approximately 25,000 complaints, including 7,000 open investigations that were simply sitting, unaddressed. The Government Accountability Office released a report in February 2026 with a finding that should make every American's blood run cold. Of the complaints that were resolved between March and September 2025, 6,353 out of 7,072 were not investigated. They were simply dismissed. NPR reported in December 2025 that, quote, by blocking OCR staff from doing their jobs, department leadership allowed a massive backlog of civil rights complaints to grow. What this means in human terms is this. If your black child is being harassed in school, if your disabled child is being denied services, if your trans child is being bullied, and you file a complaint with the federal government will throw your complaint in a pile and walk away. The door of justice has a closed sign on it, and the administration put it there on purpose. The assault on education is not limited to discipline policy, it extends to history itself. The administration has ordered the removal of DEI-related content from federal websites, content that includes civil rights history, the history of slavery, and the documented record of systemic racism in America. The National Archives, the Smithsonian, and federal educational materials have all been scrubbed of equity-focused content. The 1776 Commission, a body created during Trump's first term to promote a sanitized, whitewashed version of American history, has been reinstated. Federal grants for programs that teach about slavery, Jim Crow, and systemic racism have been canceled or threatened. The goal is not subtle. The goal is to raise a generation of Americans who do not know what happened, who do not know what was done to black people in this country, who do not know the names of the people who fought and died to change it, who will therefore have no framework for recognizing when it is being done again. You cannot fight what you are not allowed to know existed. This is not curriculum reform. This is historical revisionism in the service of white supremacy. It is the erasure of memory as a tool of oppression. And it is being done with federal dollars, federal authority, and the full weight of the United States government. The executive orders attack civil rights. The rhetoric attacks dignity. The education policies attack the future. But the administration's most devastating weapon against black and brown America is economic. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed into law on July 4th, 2025, is not a budget bill. It is not a tax reform package. It is not a fiscal responsibility measure. It is an act of economic warfare, a wealth transfer from the poor to the predator class, financed by the hunger of children and the illness of the elderly, and its impact falls, with precision and with purpose, hardest on black and brown families. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The president loves that name. He repeats it like a mantra. Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. Let us look at what is beautiful about it. The bill, signed into law on July 4th, 2025, Independence Day, with all the grotesque irony that implies, includes $863 billion in Medicaid cuts over the next 10 years. The Urban Institute projects that these cuts will remove 10.3 million people from health coverage, 10.3 million people without health insurance. In the richest country in the history of the world, the bill also includes $300 billion in cuts to SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps, the program that keeps children from going hungry. The Urban Institute found that these cuts leave almost 3 million young adults vulnerable to losing nutrition assistance. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund stated plainly, Cuts to SNAP will increase poverty, food insecurity, and hunger for children and adults, disproportionately affecting Black communities. Black Americans make up more than 25% of SNAP recipients. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities called the bill anything but beautiful, saying it would cause widespread harm by making massive cuts to Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, and other critical safety net programs. And what are these cuts funding? Tax breaks. For the wealthy, for the corporations, for the Mar-a-Lago set. The administration is creating a famine in the inner cities and the rural South to pay for the excesses of the donor class. This is not fiscal policy. This is not budget reform. This is racial plunder, dressed in legislative language and signed on Independence Day. Of all the provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there is one that stands apart. One that is so brazen, so spiteful, so nakedly racist in its intent and its effect that it deserves to be examined in full detail. The repeal of Section 22,007 of the Inflation Reduction Act. Here is the history. For decades, for generations, the United States Department of Agriculture systematically discriminated against Black farmers. It denied them loans. It denied them assistance programs. It denied them the basic support that white farmers received as a matter of course. This discrimination was documented. It was investigated. And it was admitted. The federal government admitted it had defrauded Black farmers. In response, Section 22,007 of the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, providing $2.2 billion in financial assistance to the approximately 43,000 Black farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners who had been victimized by this discrimination. John Boyd, Jr., the founder of the National Black Farmers Association and a fourth-generation farmer himself, said when the provision was passed, "After decades of discrimination and denial, justice is finally being delivered." And then the Trump administration took it away. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act repeals Section 22,007. The $2.2 billion, promised to Black farmers by a government that had already admitted its guilt, was snatched back, redirected, used to fund tax cuts for billionaires. The government admitted it discriminated. It promised to pay. And then, under this administration, it broke that promise to fund the excesses of the donor class. This is not fiscal responsibility. This is racial plunder. This is the C for colored strategy, updated for the 21st century. Instead of a letter on a rental application, it is a line item in a budget bill. But the intent is identical. Black Americans are told, your suffering does not count. Your restitution does not matter. Your justice is negotiable. Let us talk about the math. Because the math does not lie. Black Americans make up approximately 13% of the U.S. population, but they make up 21% of Medicaid enrollees and more than 25% of SNAP recipients. This is not an accident. It is the direct legacy of centuries of economic exclusion, discriminatory housing policy, and deliberate underfunding of Black communities. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act cuts $863 billion from Medicaid and $300 billion from SNAP. That is $1.163 trillion stripped from the safety net. The Kaiser Family Foundation is tracking the bill's Medicaid provisions and has found that the new work requirements and verification requirements will disproportionately affect Black and Latino enrollees. The American Medical Association issued a statement against the cuts on July 1, 2025, the day before the bill passed the House. Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health described the bill as making sweeping changes to who qualifies for Medicaid, changes that will leave millions without coverage. The administration will tell you these cuts are about fiscal responsibility, about reducing dependency, about encouraging work. But the racial math is too precise to be accidental. When you cut the programs that disproportionately serve Black and brown families and you use the savings to fund tax cuts for the wealthy, you are not making a budget decision. You are making a racial decision. This is not collateral damage. This is the intended outcome. The administration's assault on civil rights is not limited to the workplace, the classroom, or the dinner table. It extends to the most fundamental human need: shelter, housing, and urban development. The agency, created in the wake of the civil rights movement to ensure that every American had equal access to housing, has been transformed into an instrument of segregation. The philosophy of Fred Trump has returned to the federal government, and this time, it has the force of law. On February 26, 2025, HUD Secretary Scott Turner rescinded the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, a regulation that required localities receiving federal housing funds to actively track and address patterns of residential segregation. The replacement rule, called neighborhood choice, requires localities to do essentially nothing. Under the new standard, a jurisdiction simply needs to certify that it took any action at all to promote fair housing. Any action, even a symbolic one, even a meaningless one. CNN reported in March 2025 that the new rule requires jurisdictions only to certify that they took any action at all to promote fair housing. What this means in practice is that wealthy white suburbs now have a federal shield to ban affordable housing, to maintain exclusionary zoning, to ensure that the neighborhoods their residents fled to, in many cases fled to specifically to avoid integration, remain exactly as they are. Residential segregation in America is not an accident of history. It was engineered through redlining, through restrictive covenants, through the deliberate denial of mortgages to black families, through the C-for-colored coding system in Fred Trump's rental offices. The AFFH rule was an attempt, imperfect, insufficient, but genuine, to begin undoing that engineering. The Trump administration has suspended it and replaced it with a rule that means nothing. Segregation is now, once again, the unspoken law of the land, and this time, it has a federal endorsement. The suspension of the AFFH rule was devastating, but the administration was not finished with housing. On January 14, 2026, HUD proposed eliminating the disparate impact standard from Fair Housing Act enforcement. By January 21, 2026, the regulations had been rescinded. The disparate impact standard is one of the most important legal tools in the civil rights arsenal. It allows courts and regulators to find housing discrimination even when no one explicitly says the word race. If a policy or practice has a disproportionate negative effect on a protected class, even if that effect is achieved through neutral-sounding language, disparate impact allows that policy to be challenged. Without disparate impact, the bar for proving housing discrimination becomes nearly impossible to meet. You essentially need a landlord or a banker who is dumb enough to admit their racism in writing. And as the National Housing Conference noted in February 2026, disparate impact is one of the most important ways to assess intent. Congresswomen Shontel Brown and Joyce Beatty led a letter to HUD opposing the rollback, writing, "Housing discrimination is real and disparate impacts are real. A pro-discrimination approach to housing will not solve our nation's housing crisis." What this rollback enables is discrimination by algorithm. Landlords and banks can now use credit scoring models, zoning laws, income thresholds, and 100 other facially neutral criteria to exclude black families from housing, and there is no legal mechanism to challenge it. This is the C-for-colored strategy, modernized. In 1973, Fred Trump's employees stamped a letter on a piece of paper. In 2026, an algorithm does the same thing. The discrimination is equally real, but now it is invisible. And the federal government has made sure it stays that way. The administration knows its policies are unpopular. It knows that if the communities it is targeting are able to vote freely, they will vote against it. So the administration is ensuring they cannot. The voter suppression apparatus being built by this administration is the most sophisticated, most legally laundered, and most comprehensively destructive attack on voting rights since the original Jim Crow. It is not wearing a hood, it is wearing a suit, it is carrying a briefcase, and it is being executed by the Department of Justice. The Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, the SAVE Act, requires every American to provide documentary proof of United States citizenship when registering to vote in federal elections. Sounds reasonable, right? After all, only citizens should vote. But here is what the administration knows and is counting on you not to know. Millions of eligible American citizens do not possess a passport. Millions of eligible American citizens do not have easy access to their birth certificate. Millions of elderly Americans, particularly in Black and rural communities, were born at home, in an era when hospital birth certificates were not standard and have no documentation that meets the bill's requirements. The American Progress Organization stated plainly in January 2026, the SAVE Act would disenfranchise millions of citizens. The Brennan Center for Justice, one of the nation's foremost election law organizations, found in February 2026 that the new SAVE Act bills would still block millions of Americans from voting. The Campaign Legal Center called it a bill that could disenfranchise millions of eligible voters. The administration will tell you this is about election security, about preventing non-citizen voting. But non-citizen voting is, as every election security expert in the country will tell you, an extremely rare occurrence. It is not a crisis. It is not an epidemic. It is a pretext. The real purpose of the SAVE Act is surgical disenfranchisement. It is a modern poll tax, not a cash payment at the courthouse door, but a documentation requirement that functions identically. It targets the communities least likely to have the required documents. It targets the communities most likely to vote against this administration. It is Jim Crow in a business suit. The Department of Justice was created in significant part to enforce the Voting Rights Act of 1965, to be the federal guardian of the right to vote for every American, particularly those whose votes had been systematically suppressed for a century. Under this administration, the DOJ has been transformed from a protector into a predator. In December 2025, the DOJ sued 5 states for failing to turn over their complete voter rolls to federal authorities. The Brennan Center reported in February 2026 that the administration had been sending confidential draft agreements to more than a dozen states, directing them to purge voters flagged as ineligible by federal databases that civil rights organizations have documented as riddled with errors that disproportionately flag minority voters. Democracy Docket, which tracks voting rights litigation, reported just days ago that the Trump administration's DOJ is laying groundwork to question midterm results, using the voter data collection effort as a foundation for challenging the legitimacy of elections in which their candidates lose. In March 2025, the president signed an anti-voting executive order that was subsequently blocked by 3 separate federal courts as unconstitutional. The administration has appealed. The Brennan Center's analysis is unambiguous. The administration's voter data collection effort is part of the Trump administration's plans for states' voter data, plans that civil rights organizations describe as a systematic effort to suppress minority voting. The watchdog has become the wolf. The agency created to protect the vote is now being used to steal it. Let us step back. Let us look at the full picture. Because when you lay out the timeline, when you place every event, every executive order, every policy rollback, every tweet, every march, every stolen dollar, side by side in chronological order, something becomes undeniable. This is not a series of unrelated policy decisions. This is not a collection of coincidences. This is not a president who stumbled into racism by accident. This is a straight line. From Fred Trump at a Klan rally in Queens in 1927, to Woody Guthrie documenting racial hate in Brooklyn in the 1950s, to the C for Colored coding system in 1973, to the poisoning the blood and vermin rhetoric of the 2016 and 2024 campaigns, to the blizzard of executive orders on day one of the second term, to the neo-Nazis marching through Lincoln Heights, to the monkey video posted from the Oval Office on February 6, 2026. It is a straight line, unbroken, uninterrupted, spanning a century. The policies of 2025 and 2026 are not new ideas. They are the high-definition remasters of 1927. The technology has changed, the language has been laundered, the mechanisms have been modernized. But the intent, the fundamental, driving, animating intent, is identical. This is a family business, and the business is hate. One of the most dangerous things about what this administration is doing is how systematic it is. People look at the monkey video and think, that's just Trump being Trump, impulsive, reckless, unhinged. But it is not impulsive. It is a step in a process, a deliberate, engineered process that civil rights scholars and historians are now calling the permission structure for hate. Here is how it works. Step 1. The president uses his platform to dehumanize the targets: vermin, poison, monkeys. This establishes that the targets are less than human, and that the president himself endorses that view. Step 2. The press secretary normalizes the rhetoric. Fake outrage, just a joke. This signals to the country that the dehumanization is acceptable, that objecting to it makes you the problem. Step 3. Executive orders strip the legal protections from the targeted communities. The laws that protected them are gone. The agencies that enforced those laws are gutted. Step 4. Emboldened by the rhetoric and the impunity, extremists take action. Neo-Nazis march through black neighborhoods. Hate crimes increase. The targeted communities are told, in the most visceral possible terms, that the government will not protect them. Step 5. The bureaucratic machinery that would investigate and prosecute these acts is dismantled. The OCR, the OFCCP, the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, redirected to suppress votes instead of protect them. Step 6. Legislative action locks in the damage. NORA makes the executive orders lawsuit-proof. The SAVE Act makes it harder to vote them out. The One Big Beautiful Bill starves the communities into compliance. Step 7. Historical erasure ensures the next generation cannot recognize the pattern. This is not chaos. This is a system, a machine, an architecture, and it is operating exactly as designed. The administration would like you to believe that the outrage over its actions is manufactured, that it is partisan, that it is fake. The world disagrees. Amnesty International USA called the monkey video vile and dehumanizing and placed it within a trend by the president of dehumanizing rhetoric. United Nations human rights experts issued a statement expressing that they were disturbed by the president and U.S. political leaders' growing use of dehumanizing language, warning that history has proven that silence in the face of dehumanization paves the way to atrocity. Al Jazeera, Le Monde, the BBC. International news organizations across the globe covered the monkey video with the kind of alarm that is usually reserved for the early stages of authoritarian collapse. The Lawyers' Committee for Civil Rights stated, "A depiction of President Obama and Michelle Obama as apes is racist dehumanization." Full stop. The United States of America, the country that once stood before the world as a beacon of democracy, as proof that a multiracial republic could work, is now a cautionary tale, a warning, an example of what happens when the guardrails of democratic governance are dismantled, one executive order at a time. When the United Nations is more alarmed about American racism than the American government is, something has gone catastrophically wrong. The picture is dark, but it is not without resistance. 3 separate federal courts have blocked the Trump administration's anti-voting executive order, finding it unconstitutional. The administration has appealed. In August 2025, a federal judge ordered Mississippi to redraw its election maps, finding that the current maps illegally diluted the voting power of black residents. In December 2025, that same judge ordered special elections for the Mississippi Supreme Court. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the ACLU, Unitas US, and the Brennan Center for Justice are all actively litigating against the administration's most egregious actions. The courts are holding, for now, but the administration is building walls around them. The No Rogue Rulings Act is designed to ensure that every legal victory is limited in scope, that it protects only the specific plaintiffs in the specific case, while the administration continues to harm everyone else. The resistance is real. The courage of the lawyers, the activists, and the communities fighting back is real. But every legal victory is temporary until the political will to enforce civil rights is restored at the highest levels of government. And that restoration requires something the courts cannot provide: votes. We have spent this documentary talking about executive orders, legislative provisions, and legal standards. We have talked about numbers, billions of dollars, millions of people, thousands of complaints. But behind every number is a face. Behind every policy is a life. There is a black child somewhere in America tonight who will be suspended from school tomorrow, not because of what they did, but because of who they are, in a system that EO 14280 has told to stop looking at racial disparities. There is a black farmer somewhere in America tonight who spent years filling out paperwork, waiting for the restitution the government promised him for decades of discrimination, and who watched that promise get repealed in a budget bill signed on Independence Day. There is a black family somewhere in America tonight who applied for an apartment, met every stated requirement, and was rejected by an algorithm that no one can challenge anymore, because the disparate impact standard has been eliminated. There is a black voter somewhere in America tonight who has voted in every election for 40 years, who does not have a passport, who cannot easily obtain their birth certificate, and who will be turned away from the voter registration office under the SAVE Act. There is a resident of Lincoln Heights, Ohio tonight who is sleeping with one eye open because neo-Nazis marched through their neighborhood and the federal government called it a joke. There is a black federal employee somewhere in America tonight whose DEI office was shuttered on Inauguration Day, who was told on the first day of the new administration that their inclusion was wasteful. There is a black Medicaid enrollee somewhere in America tonight who does not yet know that the bill signed on July 4th, 2025, will take away their health coverage. These are not statistics. These are human beings, American citizens, whose government has declared them expendable, and we will not be silent about it. To understand what is happening right now, you must understand that it has happened before. After the Civil War during Reconstruction, black Americans experienced a brief, extraordinary flowering of freedom. They voted, they held office, they built businesses, they sent their children to school. They participated for the first time in the full promise of American democracy. And then, in 1877, the federal government abandoned them. The Compromise of 1877 withdrew federal troops from the South. Without federal protection, the gains of Reconstruction were systematically dismantled. Jim Crow laws were enacted. Black voters were disenfranchised through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright terror. Black wealth was destroyed. Black communities were bombed, burned, and massacred. This lasted for nearly a century. In 1965, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act began what historians call the Second Reconstruction, a renewed federal commitment to the equality that had been promised and then stolen. What we are witnessing in 2025 and 2026 is the third betrayal. The Second Reconstruction is being dismantled, piece by piece, with the same methodical cruelty that characterized the first betrayal. The executive orders that revoke civil rights protections, the budget cuts that destroy black economic security, the voter suppression laws that disenfranchise black voters, the rhetorical dehumanization that prepares the public to accept it all. The pattern is identical. Black Americans make progress. White backlash follows. The federal government abandons its commitment to equality. Regression ensues. This is not history repeating itself by accident. History is being deliberately reproduced by people who know exactly what they are doing and who are doing it anyway. The president did not do this alone. 218 members of the United States House of Representatives voted to pass the One Big Beautiful Bill. 218 people looked at $863 billion in Medicaid cuts and $300 billion in SNAP cuts and said, yes, this is the right thing to do. 218 people chose billionaire tax cuts over black children's food. Every Republican who voted for the SAVE Act chose disenfranchisement over democracy. Corporate America, for the most part, quietly dismantled its DEI programs after EO 14,173. Without a fight, without a public statement, without even the pretense of resistance. The boardrooms whitened themselves in compliance with a presidential order before the ink was dry. The media covered the monkey video as a controversy, a firestorm, rather than calling it what it was. A racist act by the President of the United States. Every time the media normalizes the abnormal, the bar is lowered. The next act of dehumanization becomes easier to dismiss. And then there is the silent majority, the Americans who see what is happening, who know it is wrong, who shake their heads over their morning coffee and then go about their day. Complicity is not neutrality. In the face of systematic oppression, silence is a choice, and choices have consequences. The question that history will ask, the question that your children and your grandchildren will ask, is not whether you knew. It is what you did about it. Let us be absolutely clear about what is at stake. This is not a political disagreement. This is not a difference of opinion about tax rates or immigration policy or the size of government. This is a moral emergency. The administration is not rolling back regulations. It is attempting to repeal the 20th century. It is attempting to undo 60 years of civil rights progress. The blood, the sacrifice, the lives given by Medgar Evers and Fannie Lou Hamer and John Lewis and countless others whose names we may never know. What is at stake is the legal equality of every Black American, the right to vote, the right to live where you choose, the right to work without discrimination, the right to send your child to school without fear, the right to eat, the right to receive medical care, the right to be treated as a full human being by your government. What is at stake is the integrity of American democracy itself, a democracy that has never fully lived up to its founding promise, but that has, until now, at least maintained the pretense of trying. The time machine is real. The president has successfully dragged the nation back toward the racial realities of his father's era. From the C marked on rental applications in 1973 to the monkey video posted in 2026, the trajectory is a straight line of unbroken hate. At its core, this is not a debate about policy. It is a debate about whether Black people are fully human in the eyes of the American state. Whether their suffering counts, whether their lives matter, whether their votes should be counted. And the current administration has answered that question, loudly, clearly, unmistakably. The answer is no, and that answer is unacceptable. The question is not whether this is happening. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is, what do we do about it? First, vote, register, verify your registration today. Obtain any documentation required by the SAVE Act before it takes full effect. Help your neighbors, your family members, your elderly relatives do the same. Voting is the most fundamental act of resistance available to us, and the administration knows it, which is why they are working so hard to take it away. Second, litigate. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the ACLU, the Brennan Center for Justice, and Unidos US are fighting in court every single day. They need resources. They need support. They need to know that the communities they are fighting for are behind them. Third, organize. The Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch program is a model of what community organization looks like when the government fails you. Local political action, community mutual aid networks, and grassroots organizing are the frontline defense against a federal government that has declared itself your adversary. Fourth, document. Record every act of discrimination. Report every civil rights violation. Amplify every act of hate. The administration wants these things to happen in the dark. Drag them into the light. Fifth, speak. The silence of good people is the oxygen that sustains oppression. Name what is happening. Call it what it is. Refuse to normalize it. Refuse to call it a controversy or a debate when it is, in fact, a moral emergency. Sixth, support. Black-owned businesses, Black farmers, Black community organizations. Economic solidarity is political resistance. Every dollar you direct toward the communities under attack is a vote of confidence in their survival. And seventh, remember, the people who came before us faced worse than this. They faced fire hoses and billy clubs and bombs in churches. They faced lynching and economic terrorism and the full weight of a government that had declared them less than human. And they did not give up. Neither can we. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." We have gazed into the abyss tonight. We have looked at the documentation of a century of inherited hate. We have examined the machinery of regression, built piece by piece, executive order by executive order, budget cut by budget cut. We have heard the testimony of the communities under siege. We have followed the straight line from 1927 to 2026. The time machine is real. The regression is documented. The architecture is built. But here is what the architects of regression do not want you to know. Architecture can be demolished. Machines can be stopped. Time machines can be broken. The question is not whether the evidence is sufficient. It is. The question is not whether the harm is real. It is. The question is not whether this is happening. It is. The question is whether the American people, all of us, of every race, every background, every political persuasion, have the moral courage to look at what is happening and refuse to accept it, to refuse to normalize it, to refuse to call it anything other than what it is. The answer to that question is being written right now, by all of us, every single day. What will your answer be? Everything you have heard tonight is documented. Every claim is sourced. Every statistic is verified. The sources cited on this slide represent a fraction of the evidentiary record, a record that spans federal court filings, peer-reviewed academic research, contemporaneous newspaper accounts, government documents, and reporting from dozens of the world's most credible news organizations. This is not opinion. This is not propaganda. This is the documented record of what is happening in the United States of America, right now, in real time. We encourage you to read every source, verify every claim, and then ask yourself, what does it mean that all of this is true? You have been watching The Architecture of Regression, a scathing indictment of the institutionalization of hate, produced by the Word Up Media Network, the investigative magazine. We report what others are afraid to say. If this documentary moved you, if it informed you, if it angered you, if it motivated you, then do one thing before you close this window. Share it. Share it with someone who needs to see it. Share it with someone who doesn't believe it. Share it with someone who is fighting back and needs to know they are not alone. The truth spreads one share at a time. Subscribe to the Word Up Media Network on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Follow us. Support us. Help us keep doing this work, because the work is not finished. The architecture of regression is still being built, and the people building it are counting on your silence. We refuse to be silent. We hope you will too. This has been the Word Up Media Network, the investigative magazine. Good night.